So now that we've had a chance to learn how to join two independent clauses, let's spend a little bit more time learning about other clauses. So of course, we've talked about independent, and just as a quick reminder, we said that an independent clause is any sentence that can't stand on its own. It needs to have a subject and a verb, but then we added a third dimension to it, which was it has to be a full idea. It has to be a complete thought. So what is a dependent clause? Dependent clauses, on the other hand, are the parts of a sentence that cannot stand on their own. And we can identify the dependent part of a sentence because it's preceded by what's known as subordinate conjunctions, which are words like who, when, that, which, blah, blah, blah. Any of these words count as subordinate conjunctions. Now, please keep in mind that the objective of this lesson, in fact, this course in general, is not to have you memorize these fancy English definitions. So I don't want you memorizing or just beating yourself down to remember what a subordinate conjunction is. There's never going to be a question on the SAT or ACT asking, can you define what a subordinate conjunction is? Just know that the dependent clause is signaled by words like who. What comes after any of these subordinate conjunctions is a dependent clause. Let's keep going. So dependent clauses can be anywhere in a sentence. It can be at the beginning, in the middle of a sentence, or even at the end of a sentence, as you will see, because we're going to look at various sentence formulas in just a few moments. Now, examples of dependent and independent clauses. So here we have because she needed to ask questions. Notice the first word here is because. That means what comes after it is going to be a dependent clause. Because is a subordinate conjunction, and what comes after it is a dependent clause. The blue part right here, Michelle came to school early, is an independent clause, subject, a verb, and it is a full idea. All right, so sometimes you see dependent clauses conjoined to independent clauses. Now remember, the cardinal rule that we said we are never going to break anymore is we will never put an independent clause, a comma, and then an independent clause. That is a comma splice. However, as you can see, it's okay to have a dependent clause, a comma, and an independent clause right after that. So let's read an example of this. It says, after the exam, Michelle asked more questions. After, again, is a subordinating conjunction. So we know that this part right here is dependent. So after the exam, that makes this part a dependent clause. And the other piece is Michelle asked more questions is an independent clause. Notice a dependent clause, comma, independent clause, perfectly fine. In other words, or rather, there's another way to do this. Sometimes you might have the independent clause at the beginning of a sentence. So Michelle asked more questions after the exam. Notice that this time around, we do not need a comma between those. All right, so let's move on to what I promised we would see momentarily, which is the various sentence formulas. The first one is simple sentence. It's basically an independent clause that we've seen multiple times now, so I'm sure you're very familiar. It just needs a subject and a verb, and that needs to be a complete thought. That's pretty straightforward now. The second type is what's known as a compound sentence, whereby you have two independent clauses joined by a conjunction. And again, we saw the structure of it is independent clause on the left, you need a comma fanboy, and an independent clause on the right. As a quick reminder for those who may have forgotten, fanboys are conjunctions, and it's just a mnemonic or acronym to help us remember for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or, and so. Those are the conjunctions that you need to be familiar with. The third sentence formula is a complex sentence where you might have an independent clause along with a dependent. So here's an example. Because she knows how to ski. Again, coordinating conjunction indicates that this part is dependent. Because she does not know how to ski, we have to complete it. Alexa will take lessons on our trip. So the fourth and final sentence formula that you need to know for this exams is the compound complex sentence where you have two independent clauses and a dependent clause in there. As an example, Alexa's mom packed snacks for the plane. This part right here is definitely independent. Alex's mom, subject, packed, verb, complete thought. Notice how we are conjoining Alex's mom packed snacks for the plane with a comma conjunction. That's indicating this next sentence is also a complete thought. It's an independent clause. So let's see. She could not pack water. Yes, she, subject, could not pack, verb, water, complete thought. So again, when you're joining two independent clauses, you need a comma fanboy. And then it goes on to say, because liquids do not pass through security. Now, because, again, coordinating conjunction indicating that this part right here is dependent. So now let's read the entire sentence. Alexa's mom packed snacks for the plane, but she couldn't pack water because liquids do not pass through security. Now, I feel like we've picked up some pretty solid foundations to be able to try some actual past tense questions. So let's go ahead and do that based on what we've learned so far. So, first question, we're trying to answer question 5, beginning with snowflakes. Snowflakes begin to form when water in the atmosphere freezes. It causes the water molecules to bond into a hexagonal shape. So take a moment and try to answer this question on your own. Okay, so let's go through the choices. Choice A says no change, which means we want to read this all the way through. Snowflakes begin to form when water in the atmosphere freezes. It causes the water molecules to bond into a hexagonal shape. That is a really long sentence. That's what you call a run-on, and we'll talk about that in just a few moments. So A cannot be right. It's too long of a sentence. B says, snowflakes begin to form when water in the atmosphere freezes, causing the water molecules to bond into a hexagonal shape. That sounds okay, so let's leave B there for a moment. Let's look at C. Snowflakes begin to form when the water in the atmosphere freezes, comma, it causes water molecules to bond into a hexagonal shape. So you put a comma here. This would not work. This is a comma splice. Why? The first part of it, snowflakes begin to form when water in the atmosphere freezes. That's a complete thought. Second piece, it causes the water molecules to bond into a hexagonal shape. Two independent clauses cannot be separated by a comma. Again, that would be a comma splice, so C is incorrect. And D is also incorrect for that same reason. If you can't put a comma here, because both parts, this causes the water molecules to bond into a hexagonal shape, would be independent, and the first part is also independent. So that leaves B as the best answer to this question. All right, next question is question 52, so we could start reading it from here. Houdini, who devoted considerable effort to exposing hoaxes involving spiritualism and was skeptical about the existence of supernatural beings. So Houdini, who devoted considerable effort to exposing hoaxes involving spiritualism and was skeptical about the existence of supernatural beings. Again, try this question on your own. All right. So let's go through the choices. F doesn't sound right because of this awkward and was skeptical about, so F is incorrect. What about G? Houdini, who devoted considerable effort to exposing hoaxes involving spiritualism, being skeptical. That's the wrong tense, so G is out. What about H? Houdini, who devoted considerable effort to exposing hoaxes involving spiritualism, comma, was skeptical about the existence of supernatural beings. I want to say H is great. So I think H is the answer. Let's try J. Houdini, who devoted considerable effort to exposing hoaxes involving spiritualism and was skeptical. This is a run-on sentence, so J is out. Now, 52 may not make a whole lot of sense to you just yet. But remember, as promised, we're going to be going over other punctuations. So we'll be reviewing commas. And once we review commas, this question will be a lot more understandable to you. So let's keep going. In the next lesson, we're just going to talk about run-ons and fragments and just do more practice before going on to commas.